Okay, so today I'm going to talk about comprehensible input. Comprehensible input is a language learning theory which says that the most important factor in acquiring a language is the volume of comprehensible input that you consume. So when people talk about this theory, they talk about learning a language versus acquiring a language. Learning a language is more to do with learning about the language, and it's quite conscious. Often it's when people focus on grammar, whereas acquiring a language is unconscious. It's when you're able to absorb and soak the language in and able to use it more like a native speaker would use the language. So comprehensible input focuses on language acquisition, and they also single out the most important factor being comprehensible input, which is what I'll go into more detail about in the following slides. To understand what comprehensible input is, you first should contrast output versus input. What is the difference between output and input? So first of all, output refers to when you're producing the language. So it's when you're speaking as well as writing. Input is when you're consuming the language, and that involves listening, reading, and watching. So, as you can probably guess by the name comprehensible input, the comprehensible input theory mostly focuses on input. It says that if you focus on input, sooner or later, you'll get good at output. That means sooner or later, you'll be able to speak and write naturally without having to explicitly focus too much on speaking or writing practice. Okay, now that we know what input is, what does it mean for input to be comprehensible? For input to be comprehensible, you need to understand what's being communicated, but you don't necessarily need to know how it's being communicated. What does that mean? It means that you might not need to know every single word that's being used and the definitions for you to comprehend the input that you're consuming. So how might this be possible? How might you understand what someone is saying or what you're watching, even if you don't know the words that are being used, whether you don't know the definitions precisely or whether you've never even heard those words before? Through body language and facial expressions. So if you're able to watch the person speaking, you could learn a lot about what they're trying to communicate just by their body language and their facial expressions. So input that otherwise might not be comprehensible, if you were to see the person speaking, if you're watching a video of them, then it may very well be comprehensible. If there is an audio, but there are images or video, or the person speaking is using props, that also aids in the comprehension. So if someone is describing images and pointing at the images in a picture, or if there's a video being played and they pause it every now and then to describe what's happening in the video, that may very well be comprehensible input. You might not know every single word they're saying, heard those words before, but because there are the images and videos to help you, that makes the input more comprehensible as well. And the third way input might be comprehensible is through your own prior knowledge. So this is when you're already familiar with a field or you're an expert at something and you often consume resources in that field in your native language. If you start consuming information about those topics in the language you're trying to learn, because you're familiar with the field already, you might actually understand what's being communicated, what's being said, even though you're not fully competent with the individual words. So why is it important to differentiate between input being sufficiently comprehensible versus knowing each and every single individual word. The reason that it's important is because if you know that the input being comprehensible is sufficient to acquire language, it's going to prevent you from continuously consulting the dictionary every time you don't understand a word. So every time you come across a word that you don't understand, there might be an instinct to go find the definition so that you fully understand it. The comprehensible input hypothesis says this is not only unnecessary, but it could be very inefficient. Just imagine two scenarios. So say I'm reading a book and it's comprehensible because it's at the correct level for me, and I've also read that book in English. Say it's Harry Potter, but I'm reading the Vietnamese version. But there are words here and there, maybe 10 or 20 words every page that I don't fully understand, and that if you asked me the definition, I wouldn't be able to tell you. Now, imagine two scenarios. The first scenario is that I keep reading it, knowing that I comprehend it. I just keep reading it and I have 30 minutes, and at the end of the 30 minutes, I've read about maybe 30 pages. Now compare that with if I were to stop at every single word that I didn't understand and go to the dictionary. At the end of the 30 minutes, I may have only read maybe 3 or 4 pages. So the strategy where you stop and try to understand every word, the reason it's bad, it's not intrinsically bad, but it's bad because it really restricts and limits the amount of volume that you're able to consume. So in my example, with the person who kept consulting the dictionary, they only read 3 or 4 pages in half an hour, whereas the person who just kept reading could read through maybe 30 pages. The trick here is that it needs to be comprehensible. If you're merely just reading and you don't really understand what's going on, then that's also a waste of time. So now that we know what it means for input to be comprehensible, let's talk about the optimal type of comprehensible input. So input needs to be comprehensible. We've talked about that already. But it also needs to be compelling. And by compelling, it should be interesting and engaging to the consumer. And it needs to be slightly difficult. So just imagine if the input you're consuming is too hard, it's definitely not going to be comprehensible. And if it's too easy, well, you're not going to be learning anything new. So you want it a bit more difficult than your current level. So there will be a few words that you don't understand, but as you consume and as you acquire the language, you'll start to acquire those new vocabulary, and at some point it's going to become too easy and you keep bumping up the difficulty. So these 3 criteria make input comprehensible and optimal. This criteria makes it hard in practice because it's very individualized. So what's compelling to me is not going to be compelling to you, and what's difficult to me, it might be easy for you or might be too hard for you, depending on our current level. So when you're trying to use comprehensible input as part of your learning program, you want to find input that satisfies all 3 criteria. So the next question is, isn't speaking and writing important too? Because we're learning a language so that we can communicate with others and talk to others. So intuitively, some people might think if you want to get better at speaking, then you should practice speaking. If you want to get better at writing, then go practice writing. According to this theory, output comes from input. So comprehensible input is actually the cause for output, and output is the consequence of comprehensible input. So the degree to which you're good at output, which means the degree to which you're good at speaking and writing, depends on how much comprehensible input you're able to consume and that you have consumed. One of the weaknesses of this theory is that the results are quite hard to measure. So if I consume comprehensible input, it doesn't mean that the day after, even though I understood and even though it was comprehensible, that I'm able to use those new words and those new concepts that I was consuming. The idea is, over time, we hear the phrases and we hear the words in different contexts, we keep listening, and over time, we unconsciously absorb the language and we're able to use it naturally. With this method, if you want to get good at output, just keep consuming, but don't expect the results to come immediately. So if you want to apply comprehensible input to your language learning, how do you actually do this in practice? I've got a few strategies depending on if you're a beginner or if you're an intermediate or advanced. So again, the criteria needs to be that it's comprehensible. You understand what's being communicated. It needs to be compelling and slightly difficult. So at the level of a beginner, this is difficult because to meet the first criteria, comprehensible, the level of the material needs to be very, very basic. But if it's basic, it means it might not be compelling enough for you. So the type of material that is both comprehensible and compelling for a beginner is quite rare to come by. And therefore, I've got two strategies. You might have to look for content. And you can find such things on YouTube. There are YouTube channels that specialize in teaching languages using comprehensible input. I found a very good one for French and a good one for Chinese. And the other strategy, if you're a beginner, is to find a competent tutor. So the tutor needs to be very good because they need to make their communication comprehensible using mainly the target language you're trying to learn. They need to be engaging and charismatic enough to make it compelling. And I need to be able to gauge and assess your level to make the input just slightly difficult. What I normally do is I write a message and I explain to a prospective tutor the way I'd like to be taught. And if they agree, I'll take a few trial lessons. And I also ask them for permission for me to record the lesson just for private use. And what I do is I record each lesson and I upload it privately to YouTube so that I can review it in my spare time just by listening. And I found by repeating lessons, just re-listening to lessons, I've been able to learn a lot that way as well. So those are the two strategies for beginners. And the other strategy I've already alluded to is to find content that's been translated. This is more of an intermediate or advanced strategy when you're already somewhat competent at a language. And what you do is you find your favorite books and movies that have been translated into your target language and you consume those. One, because they're likely to be comprehensible because you know what they're talking about, you know the story already. Two, if you already like them in your native language, you're probably going to find it compelling in your target language, but you want to make sure it's only slightly difficult and not too hard. Okay, so on to the last question, which is, should I always be using comprehensible input in my language learning? So I think that it's the most important factor, but then there are other factors which also determine which kind of method you should use and not use. So I think for people who are already quite consistent with their learning and they've already got a habit, they should be incorporating more and more comprehensible input into their learning program. But if you're just getting started, then I would focus on establishing the habit first. And that means doing something that's fun and easy and that's naturally appealing to you. So yeah, there's lots of different methods. There's learning grammar. There's using a textbook. There's using flashcards, apps, etc., etc. So as you're starting, I'll do anything that sort of appeals to you, just so you establish the habit, and eventually try to be practicing in a way that emphasizes input if you want to acquire the language most efficiently and effectively.